I think that's the issue. Somehow, big companies, especially in the bureaucratic part of the organization, it's not focused on outcomes. It's focused on jobs and roles. What do I need? Oh, I need an SVP of AI, kind of putting it off. Instead of saying, this is the outcome, what tasks do I need? What skills do I need? How do I match that?
Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is John Winsor. John is the executive in residence at Harvard Business School's Laboratory for Innovation Science, which studies artificial intelligence and workforce transformation strategies. He's also founder and chief executive officer of Open Assembly, a company that provides content, community, and strategic advising to organizations, people, and platforms to co-create the future of work. John is also an advisor to the digital initiative at Harvard Business School. John's the author of several books, including Beyond the Brand, Spark, Flipped, and the best-selling Baked In. His most recent book is Open Talent, Leveraging the Global Crowd to Solve Your Biggest Challenges. And previously, John was the chief innovation officer of the French global media agency Havas, which acquired his open advertising agency, Victors and Spoils, in 2015. John, welcome to Technovation. It's great to speak with you today.
Thanks for having me.
That's a great pleasure. Well, let's begin with and I've got a copy of your book here, Open Talent. Congratulations on
thanks.
Your latest work. Why don't we begin with what you mean by open talent? Define that for us, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it essentially, we tried to come up with a term that really took its seeds from open source software. That seemed to be, a really great place to start. And hence open talent. I mean, these strategies have been going around for a long time, whether it was freelancing or it was crowdsourcing or it was the gig economy. But one of the things we've seen emerge is we think, language is really important, and trying to create a common language and common process, especially for enterprises to adopt, right? And one of the things when we looked around, and we've studied this at Harvard for a while, one of the things that's happened is the gig economy has really gotten co-opted by, B2C services where algorithms are really controlling people when they work and how they work. And so, I'm a driver for Uber. I'm told by an algorithm where to go to do my work, and I'm told who to work with, so who to pick up. And so, whereas, we look at open talent as really three-pronged. One is building an external talent cloud, which includes freelancers. And that really, freelancers are really higher end folks that are kind of subject matter experts that can really launch in and help companies. And then building internal talent clouds, which are how do you kind of capture the cognitive surplus of your employees, and then open innovation contests, which is something we have a lot of experience at the lab because we build all this stuff at NASA.
Well, I want to get into each of those and have you kind of provide an overview of each. But before I do, I want to just, from a context setting perspective, the whole notion of an open talent company is something you have a lot of experience with. You founded your first version of that, I think, dating back in the 90s. But I should add, it wasn't like your first company. You had worked in traditional settings prior to that. So at a point where the term probably was not even coined, it was something that occurred to you as a model to employ. And I want to understand what the inspiration was for starting your first open talent company.
I come to the whole study of this practice not as somebody trying to figure out how to help companies use labor, but how do I build an organization with a new business model and think about what does that mean? So, it was back when my wife was a professional triathlete in Boulder, and this magazine that Billie Jean King started in the 70s called Women's Sports and Fitness was on the market. Time Inc. had bought it, and they were in the middle of bankrupting it. They had 40 editors and writers. They just couldn't make it go economically. And so I had the opportunity to buy that. And all my friends, the women athletes in Boulder, were pushing me to do it. So I flew to Nike, and Mark Parker at the time was a mid-level guy, and Tinker Hatfield. And, my question was like, hey, if I'm going to do this, I got to put all my assets on the line, right? I got to mortgage my house. I got to do all this crazy stuff. You think women will do sports? This is back in like 86, 87. And Parker was like, yeah, women are definitely going to do sports. We'll support you with a couple ads. And so, it was a huge risk for us. And so, as anybody, and I always suggest that innovation always comes from when your back's against the wall, right? You have no other course. You've got to figure it out. And so it was obvious before I purchased the magazine that the paradigm in the publishing industry, there were two big shifts. One was, how do I just reduce the number of readers to just a core readership? And then the other thing is how do I flip the paradigm? I couldn't afford 40 people in editorial staff. So I flipped the paradigm by saying, instead of the paradigm of a writer from New York who may be really into yoga, but had never rock climbed, coming to Boulder and interviewing Lynn Hill, who is one of the most prominent, rock climbers, female rock climbers in the world, and trying to go back to New York and get the story straight, there's just this propensity to get the story wrong because they don't know the nuances of what Lynn's talking about. And sometimes Lynn, you know how it is if you're a subject matter expert, you talk in a very obtuse language because you're used to your audience understanding a lot of the nuances. And so we flipped the paradigm. I got rid of the 40 editors and writers, and I hired 2 former New York editors, put them in Boulder. But I had Lynn write her own story and then had the editors edit it for the audience. Well, that kind of shift from 40 to 38 people out of the system, that cost saved up money that we were profitable right away. And so that was kind of the first inkling of that. And then one of the things that I found really interesting after the women's sports and fitness, I sold that company to Condé Nast. And so but one of the things that was frustrating when I was in the magazine publishing business is that we worked with these early adoptive consumers. And as you know, in your work in innovation and technology, there are always these kind of early adopters. There's the traditional diffusion curve, right? And you've got these early adoptive consumers that are doing really great stuff, and they could really influence the rest of the market. And so we put a group, the women in our readership, not at the bottom of the marketing funnel, at the top, and charge companies for strategy and product design using these panels. We would call them, crowds or collectives at the time. It was kind of early days of market research, kind of doing crowdsourced market research. And that worked really, really well. We worked with Nike and HP and Intel and, a slew of other companies. And then I merged that company with an agency called Crispin Porter Bogusky, which at the time was about, there were about 75 of them and there were about 14 of us. And we merged companies and I've written a few books by then on co-creation. So we put the idea of co-creation, this philosophy of, how do we use the power of people instead of us being the arrogant experts on creativity? It's the mom, who knows how to remove spots from, her kids' outfits, that is probably has a better voice on it, what's really going on for Tide, the laundry detergent than we would as a bunch of young creatives. And so we put that in the center of what we did. And it worked really well. We won $3 billion worth of business, became Creative Global Agency of the Decade, went from 100 of us to 1,200 of us in 2 years. And just a crazy ride, won all these big clients, Microsoft and Domino's and Volkswagen. And one of the things that was stressful was we couldn't find enough labor to do the work. We couldn't find enough creative labor. It was just too much, to turn. But one of the things we were trying to focus on is being innovative. So we took on a new client, an electric motorcycle company called Bramo, and literally so frustrated because we couldn't get any creatives to do the work inside. So we did the audacious move as the newly appointed, or newly awarded and creative agency of the decade. We decided to actually crowdsource the creative, which pissed off the advertising world in a huge way. But one of the things that we noticed is that, holy crap, like the guy we interviewed or the woman we interviewed, the guy we interviewed from, Sydney that couldn't come to Boulder because of family issues, or the woman we interviewed, in London really wanted to work with us, but she couldn't move either. And all of a sudden, all these amazing people were doing work for us. And it was like they were doing work during the hours that they were supposed to be working for somebody else. And it was like, this is cool. Like, how can we capture the cognitive surplus of this industry? Why do we need to move people to Boulder? All the while we know that they're going to leave pretty soon because Boulder wasn't a creative hub. And it dawned on us that this whole industry is going to just implode because you don't need to have kind of physical migration to a place like Boulder. You can digitally migrate, from anywhere in the world. And so I took that and launched my own company called Victors and Spoils. And Victors and Spoils it was an ad agency based on crowdsourcing principles. It became pretty iconic for a couple things. One is that it was a big challenge to the current paradigm, but there were really 2 things that shifted the industry. And that was, Stuart Elliott, who wrote for the New York Times, offered us this great opportunity to write an article about us. And so he wrote an article, but he said the stipulation was we couldn't launch the company until the article was written. And so in October of I guess it was 2009, we were in my garage, 3 of us who started the company, and a little freaked out, running out of money, saying, wow, think this is going to work? And that morning, the article appeared in the New York Times. And by that night, 3,000 people globally signed up to work for us. And Dish Network gave us their $110 million advertising account. So we went from zero to $15 million in net revenue in about 12 hours. And so that kind of put things on the map, right? And from our perspective, it was really exciting. Got to work. A couple of years later, with a lot of momentum and a lot of notoriety, we noticed that Harley Davidson was up for review. And like anybody else, we wanted to work for Harley, but we knew by asking for permission to be in the pitch that it wasn't going to be able to. We would never get in there because those pitches are $500,000 fares, and it's all about dinners and golf games and all these lavish lunches. And so my creative director, Evan Fry, we were out to coffee when we'd heard the news, and he's like, instead of asking for permission, let's ask for forgiveness. And we ran back to the office, and literally in 20 minutes, we, made a video to our crowd and launched it and just said, hey, we're working for Harley Davidson. I'm putting $10,000 of my own money up. Let's do some kick-ass work and see if we can get a meeting to show, that this new model works. And I wrote a blog post to Mark Hans Ricker, a letter to Mark Hans on my blog, who I'd never met before, and just saying, hey, Mark, enjoy the dinners and lunches, super nice people, really creative, really fun. As you're doing that, I got 10,000 people working on your business. Give a shout if you want to see something. And that hit Twitter. And literally 20 minutes later, Mark Hans wrote me back saying, I'd love to see the work, tired of traditional agencies. And 2 weeks later, we went to Milwaukee and won the global $1 billion Harley Davidson work, which blew up the industry. And so because of that and the notoriety, David Jones from Havas, I saw him at TED, and he said, he approached me and said, you're great at being controversial and throwing rocks at the glass houses of the holding companies. Why don't you come in here and help me fix one? And so I decided to sell Victors and Spoils to Havas and become chief innovation officer out of Paris. And it was a shit show. It was like these guys, they did not want, and the French did not want to let go of the importance of these amazing creatives in Paris. They could not see some, homemaker in Cleveland doing creative work. It was their, it was their identity, right? And so, although the project didn't go well and David lost his job, the CEO, and I decided to leave, it was super interesting. And the thing that made it so interesting was that the three guys, Mike Tushman, Kareem Lakhani, and Bharat Anand, started doing a bunch of case studies on us, wrote one on Victors and Spoils, and wrote a really big one, which is still one of the best-selling case studies at Harvard 10 years later on Havas Change Faster, on the ability for organizations to adopt to new business models. We just, in fact, went back a few months ago, and they're going to create a HBSO, Harvard Business School online class on the Havas case study. We did this 10th anniversary kind of update of it. But it's been really interesting to see, how it's great as an entrepreneur, because you're like, this is awesome. I can, reduce my costs phenomenally. I can do great work. I can use these business models. Yet it's just so hard for large organizations to adopt. So that's the stuff we've been trying to study. And I went to Harvard after the case studies and started working with the Kareem Lakhani at the Laboratory for Innovation Sciences. And one of the things that they had done is back in 2007, NASA, Jeff Davis, who was the head of Health and Human Services, he's the chief medical officer for NASA, had a real problem. He had a budget cut of 80% for the Health and Human Services division, which meant he only had 20% of the budget to keep astronauts alive in space. And so he went to Kareem, Kareem had studied under Eric von Hippel, and then that was the democratization of innovation, which was really one of the foundations of this whole body of work. And all of a sudden, we started doing projects together with Jeff, and things accelerated. We were getting phenomenal results from people around the world that wanted to do work for NASA. So next year, the Center of Excellence for Collaborative Innovation, which we built at NASA, will have a budget of $1 billion. And I think there's something really instructive here. Is like one of the things I point out in the book is you can have a mindset. Like we could look at NASA, right? And we could say, wow, innovative organization, 17,000 full-time employees, some of the most innovative people in the world, right? That would be a traditional way of looking at it. The way NASA looks at the organization is they think of themselves as a networked organization working with a workforce ecosystem. So because of COSI, they have 17,000 full-time employees. We created some software called NASA at Work that allows them to connect to their 30,000 contractors. And then COSI, the center, actually uses 40 other platforms that tap into 110 million people globally that are willing to do work for NASA. So a networked organization, an abundant mindset would be NASA has the ability to work with 110 million, 47,000 people to do hard work for them. And that mindset shift inside NASA has been really explosive and game changing.
Very
But I find it so ironic, right? I mean, I think I was on a thread this morning and somebody kind of included me something on LinkedIn, and there's a guy in Ireland trying to protect, trying to say freelancing's bad. Why should individuals have the rights to do work that our great agencies do? And he's a guy that runs an agency. And the way I responded was, I'm sure in 2006 and 7, maybe 2008, there were a bunch of, executives that published these things called phone books. And they probably railed against this thing called Google, saying, oh, Google's wrong. It's not right. We spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars creating these phone books. And that's the most authentic way to get the information to find, say, I don't know, like a dry cleaners, right? Published once a year. I found it interesting when I did some research. Do you know how much it cost to produce the 2007 Yellow Pages in Boston? $100 million.
My goodness.
$100 million for you and I to find a dry cleaner. And now that's free, right? It's free on Google. And somebody's putting up, recommendations. You get the latest information. And so my sense is every part of every industry has been digitally transformed, and talent is a place that's it's inevitable. The same thing's gonna happen.
You mentioned earlier in your response, you talked about the challenges that large organizations have with this sort of a model for obvious reasons. There's already kind of a mode of work. There's kind of a means of continuing to justify the organization that's already there, as opposed to a startup, for instance, that's a couple of people in a garage and looking for easy ways to find creative people on the cheap, for example, if I may overly simplify
for
what you're
sure.
describing. But you talked about it worked for NASA because they were a networked organization. Is that a necessary ingredient for large organizations to be able to make this work, or are there other versions of large companies or other characteristics, better put, of large companies that would allow them to do this?
I mean, I think there's a couple things. One is that I think we have to always ensure that any organization has a customer-centric, strategic mindset. And what I mean by that, and I look back to my own history, right? Back in the day, I was just so curious. Like publishing companies weren't in the business of providing information to the audience. It wasn't like, let's say, Fast Company wasn't in the business of providing the latest business information to their audience. Essentially, what transpired was the editor, his vision was that, but soon what happens, and I think this happens in every company, the biggest expenses, in this case, putting ink on paper and distributing magazines, those are the things that either make you or break you profitability from a magazine company. And so the executives that start running the company are focused on putting ink on paper and distributing the magazine. Nothing to do with satisfying the needs of the reader. That kind of the editors and the founders got kind of pushed off to the side. And I think every organization gets stuck in that, right? As time goes on, there are new ways to do the same thing. And it's unfortunate, right? I think when the internet started, I guess because I was a magazine publisher and a little bit tech savvy, I somehow just assumed that Vogue magazine was going to be innovative and own fashion online. Yet Condé Nast, all they cared about was making an efficient way of putting ink on paper and distributing a fashion magazine. So instead of being in the information industry, supplying, the greatest fashion information to their customers, however they decide to buy it or consume it, they were only in the magazine business, and they got wiped out by social media, by, online things. And I think that's the threat for every company, that you get siloed into not trying to deliver like agencies, right? Agencies, at least what I see now in this article this morning, or this opinion piece this morning, was spot on in this thinking, is that he's not thinking about like, how do I best, let's forget about the business model. How do I best deliver advertising for the consumer, for my clients, versus I'm going to protect my business model. I've got this moat and protect this antiquated business model. And it's really hard for organizations to change that.
Very interesting, John. A classic innovator's dilemma scenario that you're describing there.
For sure.
And I wonder, how do you think about the balance between internal resources, employees, when to bring on people full time versus external talent, such as the high-end freelancers you were describing earlier? How do you think about the balance between those? What sorts of roles are best equipped to have as permanent employees versus those that are not?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I would suggest that, every, not just every company as you described, becomes protective of their bureaucracy and their way of doing things, but so do divisions inside companies, right? So let's lay out a scenario. Let's just say, Peter, you were just appointed, CEO of a Fortune 500 company. It's a technology company, and the board told you first thing you need to do is an AI strategy. So, there are two ways to get that done, right? The first way, which is the traditional way, is to say, go to your CHRO and say, I need an SVP of AI. Well, how long do you think it's going to take to hire an SVP of AI today? It's going to take 6 to 8 months, right? A good one. And then you hire her, and she's going to take 3 to 4 months to hire her team. And then it's going to take 2 to 3 months to set up the processes to get the strategy done. And then you're talking about 18 months. Now, the alternative, if you have an open talent mindset, you would say, this my outcome, I need to have a strategy, right? And I don't have the talent in house. So one strategy could be to go to platforms and say, who are the 10 best people in my field that are freelance, that are around the world, that I could invite in for the weekend, experts, and sit with my team, and we can do a 2-day strategy and define what are the 100 tasks in order to accomplish that strategy, right? That outcome. And in a weekend, we could say, hey, Joe in manufacturing doesn't know anything about AI, but he knows a lot about manufacturing. So I'm going to pair him with somebody, and we're going to put these together. And those 100 tasks are going to be assigned. And within a month, you can create a pretty good strategy, right? With that team. It's not a great strategy, but 18 months and a great strategy is going to be non-existent today, right? And so I think that's the issue, is that somehow big companies especially have forgotten that, the C-suite understands it, but below that, in the bureaucratic parts of the organization, it's not focused on outcomes. It's not focused on outcomes. It's focused on jobs and roles. Like, what do I need? Oh, I need an SVP of AI. Let them decide what the role, what the tasks are. Let them decide what the skills are. Kind of putting it off instead of saying, this is the outcome. What tasks do I need? What skills do I need? How do I match that? The reality, according to Korn Ferry, is that there are 85 million tech jobs that will go unfilled by 2030. It's going to cost companies $8.5 trillion. Now, that's going to get reduced a lot with AI, the speed of which AI is growing. But it's still going to have, no matter who you are, you can't hire the best talent. They just don't want to work for you. They have this ability to go do things that they really want to do. So in that case, if there's this power shift between demand setting the terms to supply, the best supply setting the terms, if, in my mind, if you're focused on tasks and outcomes, it doesn't matter if somebody works for you full-time or part-time. You want the best talent to get the best outcomes. I think that's got to be the focus.
Yeah, really interesting. I was particularly intrigued with your chapter on how culture matters in an open talent world. I think it's
Right.
a fascinating topic because I think to the uninitiated, one of the first things they might think about is, boy, what John's talking about here is a disaster from a culture perspective because, how do you even form a culture when you don't have people that are kind of bought in enough to be permanent employees of an institution? Talk a bit about your thoughts about culture and why it does indeed matter in a scenario like what you're describing.
Yeah, so I would say anybody that thinks that if you have more than one office, that thinks that you have a specific culture, you're being naive. Like the idea that, you have 10 offices around the world, you have 10 different cultures, where the people are, and there's lots of different reasons for that, right? There's in-office culture, there's cultures that people have, in where they live and what they do and how they interpret things. I believe that the best work is always an ecosystem. I mean, you represent that, right? You help companies solve their big, strategy problems with technology and their culture problems. You're not unemployed full time. They hire you because you have a unique perspective, because you've had experiences outside of that. But you are a part of this network, right? You're part of what makes organizations really great. For me, I'm a climber and surfer, and I've spent a lifetime doing that. And so I've worked a lot over the years with Patagonia, and I was on the board of directors of Black Diamond Equipment, and all of those organizations are networked organizations and networked cultures. And one of the things we used to do at Black Diamond Peter Metcalf, the CEO, implemented the system that we would build equipment all week, Monday to Friday, and on Friday night we'd have a pizza party, and we'd take that all the equipment, the prototypes, and we'd hand it out not just to employees, but to anybody who would show up in Salt Lake to go test equipment. And that weekend, everybody would go out and they would break the equipment, they would try it. And then Sunday, we'd have a beer party and everybody come back together and mention like things. So it was building a community that was much bigger than culture. I think this idea of there's an internal culture is just wrong. Like the great cultures in the world are ones that their customers are involved in the culture and their suppliers, and there's this ecosystem of culture. So for me, and we call it in the book a networked culture, but I think that's super important to rethink what your culture is and bring in outsiders, not just great freelance talent or using open innovation tools like contests, but also, how do we distill it down so that other people can buy in? I mean, NASA is a great example, right? Like I'm sure you see it too. Every 5 years, you're walking through some fashion, district, and some brand has started to produce NASA t-shirts. And you're just like, wow, the stickiness of the NASA logo, the stickiness of the culture, like everybody wants to be part of that. And I would encourage brands and companies, no matter if they're a B2B or B2C company, like how do you do that? How do you get customers to tattoo themselves with your brand, not just the giveaway polo shirt, right? But actually say, I love this brand. This represents me. And to me, that's a strong culture.
And you've noted the necessity to focus on outcomes, which I think, again, is not the true.
For sure.
It makes so much sense, of course, but it isn't the way that traditional work is done. I mean, most people think about you arrive in the office at a certain time. I mean, granted, the pandemic has changed a lot of this.
For sure.
So the world is actually, in many ways, moving towards the insights you've been familiar with for decades now. But talk a bit about, the necessary ingredients to be able to be outcome oriented and some of the, well, frankly, cultural shifts that are necessary in order to foster that.
Yeah, I think it starts, there's a balance, right? There's a balance between, first of all, it's a bottom up and a top down solution, right? So the first thing is, and you've probably seen this, and I'm sure that we're aligned on this. It's like the current, argument about AI. Yeah, CEOs can say no AI can be used in the company, but that just isn't reality, right? Like in open talent, one of the things that we studied at Harvard, which I thought was super interesting, is that the freelancer.com, which is a platform, has only a couple dozen Fortune 500 clients. Yet 70% of Fortune 500 companies have an active corporate email that works weekly on freelancer.com. And so, you can put your head in the sand as a leader and say, these are my mandates. This is not going to happen. All the while, the reality is your workers are going to try to find really good and efficient ways to make their jobs easier. And so, first of all, it's admitting that, right? It's admitting that this is going to happen. Like these innovations happen whether we like it or not, and we have to be a part of it. So how are we going to adapt to that? And I think that's the first recognition. The second recognition is just to start experimenting. I never would recommend, whether it's AI or it's open talent, to bet the farm on let's get rid of everybody and use AI tools, or let's get rid of everybody and use freelancers. But trying to find small experiments that are non-risky, that are kind of not threatening to get work done. One of our clients, UST, who we worked with for a long time, Vinod Kartha got really interested in the space and was really stoked. And he found this really interesting place where, his HR team was supposed to put all this data into the Oracle system. But over a couple of years, they'd been just using an Excel spreadsheet. And so there all this data that was outside their system. Well, they're trying to figure out what to do. First of all, Vinod kind of mandated that the HR department do it, but they're so busy doing their day-to-day job that they couldn't get to it. So the HR department recommended that they use a consulting firm, and Vinod got a bid from the consulting firm for 3 months and $250,000. The reality, I've written a couple of case studies on Deloitte, and Deloitte, is super upfront. They charge 5 times their employee's salary, and that pays for the Deloitte brand and the Deloitte offices and all those things. It's not about the work. It's about the Deloitte brand, right? So now there are new matching ways. So Vinod went out to great platforms like Graphite found four people to do the work, bid that out to those four people, and they put together a bid for $25,000 in 5 days to do the work. So you're seeing this, like, can't get it done with a team. The external use of external tools, it's really expensive and slow, and you can do it much faster using freelancers. Now, there's a responsibility for Vinod, right? You can't just hand it over to Deloitte, and you know that it's going to get done, that they have your systems. But Vinod now has a responsibility to understand what needs to be done, to understand, the outcomes, to own those outcomes. You can't blame, Deloitte. And that's one of the things I think stopped this innovation, right? A lot of people want a neck to choke to say, oh, McKinsey, those numbers might have been right, but I wasn't successful because they gave us a bad strategy, right?
Yeah, very, very
So,
interesting. Very interesting. I want to get into, you mentioned a few different recommendations you have in your book, Open Talent. First among them was building an external talent cloud. Can you
right.
describe what you mean by that and the steps to do so?
Yeah, so we start with the idea of building a center of excellence, and that could be one person that's passionate about it, that understands the platforms, and I think sorting out what platforms can help you do a great job, of solving a problem. A couple of really interesting places that I'm intrigued with right now is in a couple of platforms. One platform that's really interesting to me is, everybody's looking for new talent, and so that the everybody's building their own offices and not call centers, but workflow centers in Latin America, because there's a lot of good tech talent down there, right? And so a lot of platforms are building, big crowds from Latin America, and it's been really, really successful. But one of the companies that we work with, called Andela, started, actually, it's such an interesting story. They noticed that there was a propensity for African talent to be over indexing on the ability to learn computer science skills, software engineering skills. So pre-pandemic, they worked with SoftBank and a few other large investors and built place-based education centers. And they've trained a third of the African tech talent. Now, coming out of the pandemic, they have, really unique things to really unique people to be involved with your business, and have really become an open talent platform with 130 countries, but really created a great process. So when you're looking for talent that not everybody else has used, or, interesting points of view, they're really interesting. Another probably more interesting case study right now is there's a platform called Invisible, and Invisible launched a bit ago, maybe 7 years ago, but in 2020, they had an interesting insight. They said, I wonder what would happen if we aggregated all the freelance talent for AI software engineers. So they put together a crowd of 2,500 software engineers that had AI specific, experience. And sure enough, in 2021, OpenAI called them, and then Meta, and then Google, and then Anthropic, all of the guys. And it's scaled radically. They're just growing, doubling every couple months. But one of the things that's happened is that Invisible has been in building those LLMs, and they know that stuff. So they've decided to create a new process called the process orchestration platform. And what they'll do, they work with large enterprises to go in and to say, here are the tasks that need to be done. Let's atomize those tasks and decide which tasks are best for humans and which tasks are best for AI, to really make you efficient. They've increased the launch of ChatGPT by 6 months. So they're really into this. But that's not stuff that any company can get experience at. Just like, no company. We just had this AI conference at Harvard at D Cubed, our big, at the business school, but our big initiative called Digital Design and Data. And this president of wealth management for JP Morgan, she said, hey, we've got 75,000 data scientists. We can't compete with LLMs. We're not even going to try to do anything like that. What we're going to do is match each one of our data scientists with the senior executive or with an executive, and every executive will sit with a AI software engineer all day long, and the AI engineer is only there to help make them more efficient. And so, Jamie Dimon's not going to be Jamie Dimon anymore. He's going to be super Jamie Dimon with all these AI tools that are going to be connected. But I think those are areas that no matter who we are as a company, we can't be fast enough in this area. We can't get the knowledge. We can't get the people. We have to use outside resources. people that have done this a lot. And so, freelance is certainly a really important thing. So building an external talent cloud would start with connecting with a few really good platforms, right? Either Invisible or in other cases, Andela, and being able to tap into kind of this higher end, subject matter expert to really accelerate things. Recently, a couple of weeks ago, Ronstadt bought Torque, and one of the things they've noticed. So Torque's a technical, crowd freelance platform, and the president of Ronstadt was really clear. The U.S. president of Ronstadt, he said, the reason we're doing it is that our margins in the staffing industry are really shitty, and we're going to put everybody, we're going to radically change our organization, and put everybody in Ronstadt Digital onto the Torque platform. And currently, when we have a client call, it takes 60 days to go through the process and to be able to deploy talent to somebody with all the analog process. Here's the brief. It goes out to 100 recruiters. 100 recruiters compete against each other to find the right talent. It takes a while. Torque can do that same work in 2 hours because they have this crowd of people ready to go, ready to work, digitally defined, ability to interview. And so those are the kind of the radical shifts that you need to do, but you can't get from here to there without employing either acquiring those companies or acquiring those kind of relationships.
Yeah, super interesting. And a complement to that, which you've alluded to, is building an internal talent marketplace. To talk a bit about how those work together.
I think that's really critical, right? In our work with NASA, one of my favorite examples in our NASA at Work platform was that a guy had just gotten commissioned or a budget for $5 million, one of the engineers inside NASA. And the project that he got the budget on was to figure out how to detect dehydration inside a spacesuit. So it's got to be, you got somebody outside of the space station. They, whatever they pee in their system, but is he dehydrated? Is he not? Nobody ever knew, right? Nobody could analyze that. And so that was the project he was working on, the idea of how do we digitally separate these kinds of two different liquids. He put that question up after he got the budget. He put that question up on the internal talent marketplace. And lo and behold, somebody else in NASA had been doing a project for a few years of digitally separating two different kinds of liquids and analyzing their content. And using those principles, he was able to accelerate 3 or 4 years worth of research and $5 million of budget. He didn't need to use the budget. He could solve that problem. And I would suggest that this points to the fact that most large organizations have probably somewhere in your organization have probably figured out the problem or a solution to the problem you're working on. Yet, because of bad communications of relying on email or even Slack, it's really hard to get that. And so the question is, how do we capture the cognitive surplus of an organization? I would say, let's forget about the external talent clouds for now, right? Like, where are the people in there that maybe he's a marketing guy or she's a marketing person, and at night she's gotten certified on Google AI training, and she's had 2 or 3 months of that. Yet there's no opportunity inside the organization for most organizations to actually cross-pollinate. Gloat's a great example of a platform that allows, that not only upskilling to be able to get new skills, but also that idea that, you, Peter, could say, I want to, be in the AI space. That's what I want to do with my career. Oh, look, there's some projects with my marketing experience that I can kind of help out on my off hours to be able to do that. I think that's a huge acceleration.
Really great overview of that as well. And then you finally noted open innovation contests as an important ingredient as well. Again, talk about those if you would.
I mean, I think for a lot of companies, that's terrifying, right? The idea that we built our identity on the quality of our work or our expertise, and my career is built on it. I mean, one of the more fascinating things that happened at Lish was that the Harvard Medical School called us, and they had been doing a thing with Broad Institute to think about new ways to sequence some DNA. And Broad had spent a couple decades, over $100 million to get this kind of, ability to sequence this DNA in 5.5 minutes. Huge success, right? The guys who did it are world famous, amazing. And so came to us, and we're curious. We were saying, wow, what happens if we just did an open contest in 1 month, right? Put the prize money at $35,000. Let's do it in a collaborative way where we invite people in. They get into the contest by actually proposing an algorithm that tested to a certain level. And then once they're in a certain level compared to the standard, once they're in, then everybody gets to see the algorithms, and it's a collaborative project with 80 people across the globe to see how fast they can build on each other, right? Well, the guys at Broad were like, there's just no way. And we spent $100 million in 3 decades doing this. We're the smartest guys in the world. There's no way this will ever happen. Well, their standard was not only does it have to beat the benchmark of their algorithm, it had to be 10% better to get in the contest. How long do you think it took for somebody outside to beat their algorithm?
Very rapidly.
24 hours.
Yeah,
24 hours.
Yeah.
But the crazy thing was the 80 folks that got in the contest, by iterating and being, psyched to do it. And what we find in the NASA work, right, there's 3 reasons that people play on open innovation platforms. One is for the money, right? But also for the glory. Like, I solved an algorithm for Broad. And also for the guts. Like, can I compete with this? And so over the next 3 weeks, this crowd did the work. Guess how fast the sequencing happened by a guy out of Poland?
Minutes?
14 seconds. From 5.5 minutes to 14 seconds. And the top 25 algorithms were all under 30 seconds.
My goodness.
And so if you're looking to solve really hard problems, unfortunately, what I've seen, and I bet you've seen the same thing, it is that when companies run into really hard problems, they tend to start putting them on the back burner. Oh, we spent tens of millions of dollars on that. We can't figure it out. We've got more pressing things. That's not a big deal. Our suggestion always is to let's pull those out of the warehouse or out of the closet and start giving those over to contests to see if people can kind of push them along. And what we find is it's not the fact that there are smarter people outside your company. It's the fact that a lot of those folks have adjacent knowledge that your experts didn't even know existed because it's not what they do. The guy that solved the Broad Institute problem, he is a mathematician. He solved a lot of problems for us, made a lot of money, but he's never done a DNA sequencing or any biological problem at all. It's just that he had such a different perspective on how to look at the problem. He's able to solve it. And I would suggest that every company has intractable problems that they cannot solve, and they need that adjacent knowledge. And open innovation capabilities allow you to think about things in a new way.
Are there like platforms that you would recommend using, or what?
Yeah. So Wazoku is a really amazing platform. They focus on the innovation space. So they'll do innovation consulting, but they bought a platform called Innocentive, which is one of the granddaddies of the space. And Innocentive's done more work than anybody else. There are a few others, but those guys are, the best. The problem with these open innovation platforms that we've seen are great platforms come along like Kaggle, and then Kaggle gets bought by Google, and Google takes up 100% of their capacity. So Kaggle's still around. They still do amazing work. They have an amazing community that does that work. It's just 100% of their capacity is taken up by Google.
That makes sense. So we've talked about AI in a variety of different ways. I want to kind of more squarely talk about artificial intelligence and the role you see it playing. It sounds as though you're largely an optimist relative to the topic. You certainly see the necessity for companies to delve into it rather than to stick their heads in the sand, as you noted. Talk about how your own experience with it has informed what you think the future of these work models are with enhanced with artificial intelligence.
It's interesting, right? So I played just like you, played a lot with it. I mean, one of the things that I found pretty profound was that I took all my manuscript, all my writing, and put it into its own GPT. And then when somebody asks me a question of like, what are the 3 ways to build an external talent cloud? I just go to my tool and it builds that for me. And so, it's based on my information. I can do that. I've actually written a few articles for HBR, not telling HBR that I've used the AI to build it, and it slid right through. And they're like, this is amazing. What a great article. And so I think that that's just the reality. Like it to me, I love this image that you probably saw in the book. There's in 1900, there was a picture of, Fifth Avenue, a crossway on Fifth Avenue, an intersection, and there were all horses, just jam-packed with horses and one car. And literally 13 years later, that same intersection was packed with cars and one horse. And I think that's what we're talking about here, right? If you were a buggy whip manufacturer, you could rail all day long off on the fact that, cars are unsafe, they're dangerous, they're horrible. In fact, if you look back in history, one of the things that I find super interesting is there's there were some laws in Massachusetts that I found, crazy. One was if you owned an automobile and you came to an intersection, you had to get out of the car as a driver with flags, get all of the animals to stop, and then you could proceed through. That was the first one. The crazier one was if you see an animal and you're driving down the road, you have to stop and disassemble your automobile, hide it behind a tree. And then when the coast is clear, you could come back on the road and reassemble it. So I think that's a little bit what's happening, right? Is I think that there's a lot of AI is in reality. It's going to happen. Either we engage with it and decide what's good and bad, and how do we put some guardrails on it, or we can stand on the sidelines and complain about it, but that's not going to get us anywhere. And I think it's going to be an incredibly powerful tool. Who knows what the outcome is going to be? I think we have to figure out who should we follow. And one of the people I follow a lot is Ethan Malik, who's wrote a book on co-intelligence and is right at the top of the game. And it's super fascinating space. I think it's going to be profound, right? And I think that it's going to cause a lot of big cultural shifts. My sense is that even the sense of what work is and our identities as our work identities are going to be radically shifted and probably dinged by a lot of this stuff, right? How soon, it's going to be my AI agent talking to your AI agent, coming up with some copy for an article that we can approve, right? That's the way it's going to work. So who knows? I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but it's up in the air.
Yeah,
for sure.
indeed. John, here at the close of the conversation, I'd love to have you diagnose what the secrets to your success have been. You've had such an interesting and varied career. You've been able to draw insights and inspirations from across very different experiences. You seem to maintain great curiosity as your career and life has unfolded. What do you attribute some of the secrets to your success? What are some of the ingredients to that?
I mean, yeah, that's a great question. I would say my success has been built on my failures. I'm not a detailed guy. I can't, I can't plan out things a long time in advance. I've tried to, I have been a CEO 6 times and successfully, but I'm just super curious, right? I'm not a guy. It's a great example. My buddy Jim Collins, who I've climbed with a bunch, he's here in Boulder. When he was writing, before he wrote, Built to Last, he had this rock climbing project in Eldo that's right down the road from us. He spent 3 years working on a rock climb that was about 100 feet long. Like, he documented every move. He analyzed it. He figured it out, and he was super successful at it. I can't do that. I'm more interested in, like, asking why not, kind of, exploring around the corner, over the horizon. I think that's some of it. I think that, it's not, it's some of it's curiosity, but some of it's resilience. I've had a few tragedies have happened in my life, and it's, you just have to keep moving forward, right? You have one step at a time and figure out what's next. I think we're in for a real difficult time, especially for large companies and especially for guys our age that have been running those companies. Their identity's tied up in, having a big company and having a bunch of employees. And I think those days are going to be gone, right? Unfortunately, the unit of organization is going to be much smaller. And what the Sam Altman's question of, like, it's going to be within the year, there's going to be $1 billion public company with one employee. And I think that's going to be true, right? These tools are super powerful, but it's not just the radical shifts with organization. It's the radical shifts for the identity of who people are. Like, what does that mean, right? If I don't have my office to go to and don't have my employees to report to. And so we've got to rethink that. I think that's the coming crisis. How do we deal with that?
Well, John, thank you so much for an interesting conversation, and congratulations again on your book. It is Open Talent, Leveraging the Global Crowd to Solve Your Biggest Challenges. Thank you for sharing your insights through this conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. It's really great to get to know you and psyched to learn more about your work.